December 16, 1944. 18 American teenagers armed with nothing but rifles watched in horror as 500 elite Nazi SS troops marched toward their position, singing victoriously, expecting an easy slaughter. For 18 brutal hours, these ordinary boys turned that hillside into a graveyard, inflicting casualties the Germans never saw coming until they ran out of bullets and the SS commander ordered them executed on the spot. But here's what nobody tells you. Why did the same Nazi division known for massacring prisoners suddenly decide these 18 Americans deserve to live? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 16, 1944. The world was at war. Not just any war, the biggest war in all of human history. For 5 long years, armies had been fighting across Europe. Millions of men had died. Cities had been turned into piles of broken stone and ash. Families had been torn apart. Children had grown up knowing only the sound of bombs and the taste of hunger. In Germany, Adolf Hitler ruled with an iron fist. His Nazi party controlled everything: what you said, what you thought, what you believed. The Nazis told the German people they were the master race. They said they were destined to rule the world. They said their enemies were weak and pathetic, especially the Americans. The propaganda films showed American soldiers as soft boys who couldn't fight, spoiled children from a rich country who would run at the first sign of danger. Hitler's army, the Wehrmacht, had conquered most of Europe. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. Poland was crushed in days. The German war machine seemed unstoppable. Their tanks were the best in the world. Their soldiers were trained from childhood to be warriors. Their generals were brilliant and ruthless. And the most feared of all were the SS divisions, the Schutzstaffel, elite soldiers who wore black uniforms and swore personal loyalty to Hitler himself. These men were fanatics. They had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, where the fighting was so brutal it made hell look peaceful. But by late 1944, things were changing. The Americans had landed in France on D-Day in June. Slowly, steadily, the Allies were pushing the Germans back toward their homeland. Hitler knew he was losing. He could feel his empire crumbling. So he made one last desperate gamble. He would launch a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. He would split the Allied armies in half. He would capture the port of Antwerp and cut off their supplies. And then, maybe, just maybe, he could force them to negotiate peace. The Germans called it Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The Allies would later call it the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler gathered his best remaining divisions. He gave them his newest tanks. He saved up fuel and ammunition for months. And he picked the perfect time to strike: winter. The weather would be so bad that American planes couldn't fly. The fog would be so thick you couldn't see 20 feet ahead. The snow would be so deep it would slow down any response. The Ardennes forest was dense and dark. Tall pine trees blocked out the winter sun. The roads were narrow and winding. Small villages dotted the landscape, places where farmers had lived for hundreds of years in stone houses with thick walls and steep roofs. These people had seen wars before. Napoleon's armies had marched through here. The Germans had invaded in World War I. Now, in 1944, the war had come back to their doorsteps. One of these villages was called Lanzerath. It sat right on the border between Belgium and Germany. Fewer than 300 people lived there. There was a small church with a bell tower, a cafe where old men played cards and drank coffee, 3 main houses made of gray stone, fields that, in peacetime, grew potatoes and wheat, and a single road that wound through the village and up into the hills beyond. That road was important, very important. It led to the town of Buchenbach, and from there to the whole Allied supply network. Whoever controlled Lanzerath controlled the gateway to those supplies. The German generals knew this. They marked it on their maps with a red circle. On December 15th, the village was quiet, almost peaceful. American soldiers had been stationed there for weeks, but they were bored. Nothing ever happened in Lanzerath. The real fighting was happening far to the north and south. Here, it was what the soldiers called a quiet sector, a place where new units came to rest and train, a place where you could catch your breath before being sent somewhere dangerous. Lieutenant Lyle Buck was 21 years old. He looked even younger. Thin face, serious eyes. He commanded an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Infantry Division. Everyone called them the I&R platoon. Their job was simple: watch, listen, report. They were supposed to spot enemy movements and radio back to headquarters. They were not supposed to fight. They had 18 men total. Not a full infantry company with 100 soldiers. Not even a full platoon of 40. Just 18. Most of Buck's men were teenagers, farm boys from Iowa and Pennsylvania, factory workers from Ohio and Michigan. A few had finished high school. None had been to college. They had basic training, sure. They knew how to shoot a rifle and dig a foxhole. But they weren't paratroopers. They weren't rangers. They weren't the tough guys you saw in the propaganda posters. They were ordinary American kids who had been drafted and sent across the ocean to do their part. Buck had positioned his men on a hillside overlooking Lanzerath. It was a good spot. You could see the whole village below. You could see the road coming in from Germany. You could see for almost a mile in every direction when the fog lifted. His men had dug foxholes into the frozen ground. It had taken hours. The earth was hard as concrete. They had covered the holes with logs and pine branches for camouflage. They had their rifles, a few Browning automatic rifles, one precious .50 caliber machine gun, some hand grenades, and a radio that barely worked half the time. The weather was miserable. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The wind cut through their uniforms like knives. They had no winter gear. The army hadn't expected them to be here this late in the season. Some of the men wrapped themselves in blankets. Others stuffed newspaper inside their jackets for insulation. Their hands were so cold they could barely feel their fingers. Their feet ached with the beginning of frostbite. On the night of December 15th, Boak's men heard strange sounds. Engines. Lots of engines. Coming from the German side of the border. Metal clanking against metal. The rumble of heavy vehicles. Boak grabbed his binoculars and stared into the darkness, but he couldn't see anything. The fog was too thick. He radioed headquarters. They told him not to worry. Probably just normal German traffic. Nothing to be concerned about. But Boak was concerned. Very concerned. Something felt wrong. The sounds were getting louder, more frequent. He could hear voices now, German voices, thousands of them. He radioed again. The officer on the other end sounded annoyed. "Stop being paranoid, kid. Get some sleep." Boak didn't sleep. Neither did his men. They sat in their frozen foxholes, clutching their rifles, listening to the night, waiting. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, the world exploded. German artillery opened fire all along the Ardennes front. Thousands of guns, all at once. The sound was like the end of the world. Shells screamed overhead. The ground shook. Trees burst apart. The sky lit up with orange flashes, even though the sun hadn't risen yet. Boak's men pressed themselves into the bottoms of their foxholes. Dirt rained down on them. Shrapnel whistled past. The barrage lasted for 90 minutes of pure terror. When it finally stopped, their ears were ringing so loud they could barely hear each other shout. Then the fog began to clear, just a little, just enough. And Boak looked down the hillside toward Lanzerath and felt his stomach drop. Marching up the road in perfect formation were German soldiers, hundreds of them, maybe 500, maybe more. They wore winter camouflage. They carried the best weapons Germany could make. And they were singing, actually singing, like they were on a parade ground back home, like this was going to be easy. Boak raised his binoculars with shaking hands. He could see their insignia now. His blood turned to ice. These weren't regular Wehrmacht soldiers. These were SS, the elite, the fanatics. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, veterans who had fought at Kursk and Kharkov, men who took no prisoners and expected no mercy. 500 of them, against 18 American kids with rifles? Boak grabbed the radio. His voice cracked as he called headquarters. "We need reinforcements. We need tanks. We need help, now." The voice on the other end was calm, almost bored. "No reinforcements available. Hold your position. Do not withdraw. That is a direct order." Buck looked at his men. They were staring at him with wide eyes, waiting for orders, waiting for him to tell them what to do. He was 21 years old. He had never been in real combat before. None of them had. And now they were supposed to stop an SS division? It was insane. It was suicide. But the order was clear. Hold your position at all costs. The Germans kept marching closer. They were relaxed, rifles slung over their shoulders. Some were smoking cigarettes. Others laughed and joked with each other. They had no idea that 18 Americans were watching them from hidden positions on the hillside above. The SS officers had maps that showed Lanzerath as undefended, empty, a ghost town they could walk through in 30 minutes and then keep moving toward their real objectives deeper into Belgium. This was supposed to be the easy part of their mission. Buck watched them through his binoculars. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. The Germans were now 400 yards away, then 300. The column seemed endless. Soldiers, more soldiers, officers on motorcycles, supply trucks. They filled the entire road and spilled into the fields on both sides. Buck did quick math in his head. At least 500 men, probably more, against his 18. The odds were almost 30 to 1. He crawled from foxhole to foxhole, whispering orders to his men. "Let them get close, real close. Wait for my signal. Do not fire until I fire. Make every single shot count. We only get one chance at surprise." The men nodded. Their faces were pale. Some were praying quietly. Others just gripped their rifles tighter. Private Bill James was manning the .50 caliber machine gun. His hands were shaking. Buck put a hand on his shoulder. "You can do this," he whispered. James swallowed hard and nodded. The Germans reached 200 yards, then 150. Buck could see their faces now. Young faces, old faces, confident faces. They were still singing, some marching song about Deutschland and glory and victory. They had conquered most of Europe. They had crushed armies 10 times the size of this tiny American platoon. They were the elite, the best soldiers Germany had, and they were walking into a trap. 100 yards. Buck took a deep breath. He raised his rifle, aimed at a German officer in the front of the column, squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The officer dropped like a puppet with cut strings. For one frozen second, nothing happened. The Germans looked confused. Where did that shot come from? Then Buck shouted, "Fire!" and all hell broke loose. 18 rifles opened up at once. The .50 caliber machine gun roared to life. Germans fell by the dozens. They had been packed so tight on the road that almost every bullet hit someone. The singing stopped, replaced by screaming. Officers were yelling orders, but nobody could hear them over the gunfire. Soldiers dove for cover behind trees and into ditches. Some tried to return fire, but they couldn't see where the Americans were. The camouflaged foxholes were invisible against the hillside. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bill James kept the .50 caliber sweeping back and forth across the road. The big gun sounded like a giant zipper ripping open. Tracers streaked through the morning fog. Everywhere they touched, men died. A German machine gun team tried to set up their weapon. James cut them down before they could fire a shot. Another group tried to rush the hill. Rifle fire from 6 different foxholes stopped them cold. The Germans had expected to fight, eventually, but not here, not now, not like this. They thought they were fighting soft Americans, boys who would panic and run. Instead, they were pinned down by precise, disciplined fire from an enemy they couldn't even see. It was their worst nightmare. The SS troops scrambled for any cover they could find. Stone walls, farm equipment, dead horses, anything. A German captain stood up and tried to rally his men. Bulge shot him. Another officer took his place. Someone else shot him too. The Germans were used to terrifying their enemies, used to seeing men throw down their weapons and flee. But these Americans weren't fleeing. They were killing with cold efficiency. Hours passed. The Germans tried 3 times to flank the American position. Each time, Bulge shifted his men to cover the threat. He had them move between foxholes constantly, fire a few shots from one position, then crawl to another and fire from there. It made the Germans think they were fighting a whole company, maybe even a battalion. How else could Americans be shooting from so many different places at once? The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley. Spent shell casings piled up in the foxholes. The barrels of the rifles grew hot to the touch. The men's shoulders ached from the recoil. Their ears rang from the constant noise. But they kept firing, kept reloading, kept fighting. Every time a German showed himself, an American bullet found him. By noon, the road below was littered with bodies. German medics tried to reach the wounded, but rifle fire drove them back. The SS battalion commander was furious. He had lost over 100 men and hadn't even seen the enemy yet. He called for artillery support. Minutes later, German mortars began dropping shells on the hillside. The Americans pressed themselves into their foxholes as explosions tore up the ground around them. Dirt and shrapnel rained down. But the foxholes held. The logs and earth protected them. When the barrage stopped, the Germans charged again. This time they came in a huge wave, screaming, firing from the hip, determined to overrun the American position through sheer numbers. Bulge's men met them with everything they had. The .50 caliber gun never stopped firing. Rifles cracked non-stop. Men threw grenades down the hillside and watched them explode in clusters of German soldiers. The charge broke. The survivors retreated back down the hill, leaving more dead behind. One of Bulge's men, a kid named Jordan, was hit in the shoulder by a bullet. He barely noticed, just stuffed some gauze into the wound and kept shooting. Another soldier, Milosevic, had shrapnel in his leg. He tied a belt around it to stop the bleeding and went back to his rifle. They all knew that if they stopped fighting, they were dead. So they didn't stop. As darkness fell on December 16th, the firing slowed. Both sides were exhausted. The Germans pulled back to regroup. Bulge counted his men. Amazingly, only one was seriously wounded. Everyone else was still able to fight. But when he checked their ammunition, his heart sank. They were almost out. Each man had maybe 20 rounds left. The .50 caliber was down to its last belt. They had maybe a dozen grenades total. Bulge knew what was coming. The Germans would attack again at dawn, with fresh troops, more artillery, and this time the Americans wouldn't have enough bullets to stop them. But they had done something incredible. They had held off 500 elite SS troops for an entire day. 12 hours. The German advance, which was supposed to punch through here in 30 minutes, was stuck. Completely stuck. Miles behind schedule. And somewhere behind the American lines, reinforcements were digging in, setting up defenses, getting ready. All because 18 kids refused to run. Dawn came cold and gray on December 17th. Bauck and his men sat in their foxholes, shivering, exhausted, and nearly out of ammunition. They had not slept. How could they? Every sound in the darkness made them jump. Every crack of a branch might be a German scout. They chewed on frozen K-rations and tried to keep their fingers from going numb. Some of them wrote letters home in their heads, letters they knew they would never get to send. When the sun finally rose, they saw what they were facing. The Germans had brought reinforcements during the night. Fresh troops, more machine guns. And now they were everywhere, surrounding the hillside on 3 sides. There was no escape route, no way out. Bauck looked through his binoculars and counted at least 200 soldiers visible. Who knows how many more were hidden in the tree line? The attack came at 7 in the morning. Not a wild charge this time. The Germans had learned. They came slowly, carefully, using every bit of cover. Squads moved forward while others provided covering fire. It was textbook infantry tactics. Professional, deadly. Bauck's men fired back with their last ammunition. Each shot had to count now. There were no bullets to waste. The .50 caliber machine gun fell silent after 2 minutes. Out of ammo. Bill James sat behind it crying with frustration. The Germans got closer. 50 yards, 40, 30. Close enough to throw grenades. Explosions rocked the American foxholes. One landed right next to Private Robinson. The blast threw him into the air. He landed hard and didn't move. Now they were down to 17. The Germans were so close, Bauck could hear them talking to each other, coordinating, getting ready for the final rush. Buck fired his last bullet, heard the click of an empty chamber. Around him, other rifles were clicking empty too. This was it, the end. He grabbed his entrenching tool, the small shovel they used to dig foxholes. If the Germans came now, he would fight them with that. Fight them with his bare hands if he had to. He looked at his men, saw the same desperate determination in their eyes. They had held for 18 hours, killed over 100 Germans, delayed an entire SS division. But now it was over. A German officer stood up and shouted something. Commands. The final assault. Soldiers rose from cover all around the hillside. Buck raised his empty rifle like a club. Then he heard a voice, in English, loud and clear. Americans, surrender now. You have fought well. Surrender and you will be treated fairly. Continue and you will all die. Buck looked at his men. They were bleeding, frozen, out of ammunition. He had kept them alive this long. He couldn't let them die in a pointless last stand. He stood up slowly, hands raised, and shouted the hardest word he had ever spoken. Surrender. One by one, his men climbed out of their foxholes. Hands up. Weapons dropped. The Germans moved in quickly, rifles pointed, shouting orders. They zip-tied the Americans' hands behind their backs, searched them roughly for hidden weapons. One SS soldier kicked Jordan in his wounded shoulder just for fun. Jordan gasped but didn't cry out, wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The Germans marched them down the hillside at gunpoint, past the bodies of their own dead, past the craters from grenades, past the spent shell casings that carpeted the ground. At the bottom of the hill, a group of SS officers waited. One of them, a colonel, walked slowly along the line of American prisoners. He stopped in front of Buck, looked him up and down. "How many?" he asked in perfect English. Buck didn't understand. "How many men do you have?" The colonel's voice was sharp, dangerous. Buck swallowed. 18, he said quietly. The colonel's face went red. 18? You are telling me that 18 men did this? He gestured at the carnage around them, the bodies, the destroyed equipment, the delay that had cost them a full day of their offensive. Buck said nothing, just stared straight ahead. The colonel turned and barked orders in German. The SS soldiers grabbed the Americans and shoved them against a stone wall, lined them up in a row. This was it. Buck had heard the stories. The SS didn't take prisoners. Not usually. Especially not prisoners who had killed so many of their men. Especially not when they were already behind schedule and angry. He heard rifle bolts clicking, heard his men breathing hard beside him. Someone was praying. Someone else was crying. Buck closed his eyes. Then he heard shouting, arguing, in German. He opened his eyes and saw two officers yelling at each other. The angry colonel who wanted them dead, and an older major who was shaking his head, pointing at the Americans, pointing at the hillside. The argument went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute. Finally, the major seemed to win. He walked over to the Americans, looked at them with something that might have been respect, might have been pity.
"You will not be shot," he said in careful English. "You fought as soldiers, with honor, with courage. You will be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention." The colonel looked furious but said nothing. The major gave an order, and the SS troops lowered their rifles. Book felt his knees go weak. They were alive. Somehow, against all odds, they were alive. As they were marched away toward the German rear lines, Book looked back at the hillside one last time. 18 foxholes, 18 American boys, against 500 of Germany's best, and they had held. The Germans had expected soft Americans, cowards who would run. Instead, they found something they didn't understand, something their propaganda had never prepared them for. They found Americans who refused to quit, who fought with everything they had until they had nothing left, who chose death over surrender until surrender was the only way to save their men. The German major walked beside Book as they marched. He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, almost to himself. "We were told you were weak, that you could not fight, that you would break easily." He looked at Book. "They lied to us." Book said nothing, but inside he felt something. Not pride exactly, not happiness, just the knowledge that he and his men had done something that would echo far beyond this frozen hillside. They had shown the enemy that Americans don't break, that freedom makes you strong, not weak, that ordinary people, when pushed, can do extraordinary things. The Germans had learned a lesson at Lanzerath, a lesson written in blood and frozen earth, a lesson they would never forget. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead. The concentration camps were liberated. The cities were rubble. And slowly, painfully, the prisoners of war began coming home. Book and his men had spent 5 months in German POW camps. They had been cold, hungry, sick, but they had survived, all 18 of them. Against impossible odds, every single man who fought on that hillside made it home alive. Book stepped off a transport ship in New York Harbor in June of 1945. The Statue of Liberty stood tall in the sunshine. People were cheering, bands were playing, girls were kissing soldiers they had never met. It should have felt like a victory, like a celebration, but Book felt empty, hollow. He thought about Lanzerath every single day, every single night. In his dreams, he was back in that frozen foxhole, watching 500 Germans march toward him. In his dreams, he heard the rifle fire and the screams and the explosions. He woke up sweating, even though it was summer. The army gave him a bus ticket home to St. Louis, gave him a small check for his service, thanked him politely, and sent him on his way. No parade, no medals, no recognition. The Battle of the Bulge had been so big, so chaotic, that their small stand at Lanzerath got lost in the shuffle, buried under reports of entire divisions fighting, thousands of men dying, whole towns destroyed. What were 18 guys in foxholes compared to all that? Book went to college on the GI Bill, became a chiropractor, got married, had children, built a quiet, normal life. But he never forgot. How could he? His men scattered across America. They became teachers and mechanics and farmers and salesmen. They went to work every day, mowed their lawns, coached Little League, and almost never talked about the war. When people asked what they did in the war, they gave short answers. Saw some action in Belgium, nothing special. Move along. But it was special. They knew it was special. They just didn't have the words to explain it. Didn't have the proof. All the official records said their platoon had been overrun quickly, that they had put up a brief fight and surrendered. Nothing about holding off 500 men. Nothing about the 18 hours. Nothing about changing the course of the battle. The army had lost track of the details. Or maybe nobody had bothered to write them down in the first place. So the men stayed quiet and got on with their lives. Across the ocean, Germany was rebuilding. Slowly, painfully. The Marshall Plan poured in American money. The cities that had been bombed into dust began to rise again. But the scars went deeper than buildings. The German people had to face what they had done, what they had supported, what they had believed. The concentration camps, the genocide, the war of conquest that had killed tens of millions. It was hard to look in the mirror. Some of the German soldiers who fought at Lanzerath came home too, the ones who survived the rest of the war, the ones who weren't killed in the final desperate battles as the Allies closed in on Berlin. They returned to a country that didn't exist anymore. The Third Reich was gone. The maps had been redrawn. Germany was split in two, occupied, defeated, humiliated. Everything they had been promised was a lie. The master race, the 1,000-year Reich, the invincible Wehrmacht, all lies. These men remembered Lanzerath. How could they forget? They remembered marching confidently up that road, singing, expecting an easy victory. They remembered the sudden eruption of gunfire, the shock, the terror, the hours of being pinned down by an enemy they couldn't see, the piles of their dead. And when they finally overran the position and found only 18 Americans, the stunned disbelief. 18. Just 18. In the years after the war, some of these German veterans talked quietly among themselves, in beer halls, at reunions. They admitted things they would never say publicly. They had been lied to about the Americans. The propaganda films showing soft, cowardly soldiers were completely wrong. Those boys at Lanzerath had fought like demons, had held their ground when any sane person would have run, had inflicted casualties that a full battalion would be proud of, and they had done it with almost no ammunition, no support, no hope of rescue. One German veteran, a man named Klaus, who had been a young lieutenant at Lanzerath, kept a diary. In it, he wrote something that haunted him for the rest of his life. "We thought we were the elite. We thought we were the best soldiers in the world, but 18 American farm boys stopped our entire division for a day. What does that say about us? What does that say about everything we believed?" The contrast was impossible to ignore. Germany had poured everything into its war machine, had built the best tanks, trained the most ruthless soldiers, created an entire society focused on military might. And they had been beaten, not by some other military superpower with a warrior tradition, but by America, a nation of civilians, of shopkeepers and farmers and factory workers who had been civilians 2 years earlier, who didn't want to fight, who just wanted to go home, but who, when pushed, refused to break. Klaus came back to a Germany that was learning a hard truth. Military might without justice is just brutality. Strength without morality is just thuggery. The Nazis had been strong, but they had been wrong. And in the end, that wrongness had destroyed them. Meanwhile, America, the country they had mocked as weak and decadent, had mobilized millions of ordinary people who fought not because they loved war, but because they loved freedom. And that made all the difference. For 36 years, Book and his men lived with their memories in silence. Then, in 1981, something changed. A military historian was researching the Battle of the Bulge. He was reading through old German documents that had been captured after the war, and he found something interesting.
Reports from the 1st SS Panzer Division. Complaints about a delay at a village called Lanzerath. Casualty lists showing over 100 men lost in one day. Angry demands to know why a single American position had held them up for so long. The historian dug deeper, found American after-action reports, interviewed survivors, pieced together what had actually happened on that frozen hillside. And he was stunned. This wasn't just a good defensive stand. This was one of the most incredible small unit actions in American military history. 18 men, 500 Germans, 18 hours. It was almost unbelievable, but it was true. Every word. He wrote a book, gave interviews, made noise. Finally, the Army took notice. An investigation was launched, documents were reviewed, witnesses were interviewed. And on May 5, 1981, President Ronald Reagan signed an order. Lieutenant Lyle Book and his 18-man platoon were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor that can be given to a military unit. 36 years late, but it was real. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon. Book was 58 years old now, gray hair, reading glasses, a quiet man who ran a chiropractic clinic in California. His men came from all over the country, teachers and plumbers and retirees. They stood together for the first time in decades. Some of them cried, some of them laughed, all of them remembered. And standing in the back of the room was an old man with a thick German accent. His name was Klaus, the same Klaus who had kept the diary, who had been a young lieutenant at Lanzerath. He had read about the ceremony in a newspaper, had flown all the way from Germany to be there. After the official ceremony ended, he walked slowly up to Book. The two men stood face to face, old enemies, old soldiers. Klaus spoke first. His English was careful, formal. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "You and your men taught us a lesson that day. We thought American soldiers were soft, weak. Our propaganda told us you would run at the first shot. But you didn't run. You fought harder than anyone I ever saw in the war. And you fought not because you were told to, not because you were fanatics, but because you believed in something worth fighting for. That is real strength." Book didn't know what to say. After a long pause, he shook Klaus's hand. "We were just doing our job," he said. Klaus shook his head. "No, you were doing more than your job. You were showing us what free men can do when they refuse to quit. We lost the war because we believed our own lies. We believed might makes right. We believed we were superior. But you proved that wrong. On that hillside, in those foxholes, 18 of you proved it wrong." The two men talked for an hour about the war, about what came after, about the lives they had built from the ruins, about the children and grandchildren they were raising in a world that, while still dangerous, was better than the one they had fought in. And Klaus said something that stuck with Book for the rest of his life. "Your country won the war not because you had more tanks or more planes. You won because ordinary Americans, when called upon, became extraordinary. That is something we never understood until it was too late." Book went home to California after the ceremony, back to his quiet life. But something had changed. The recognition mattered. Not because of the medal, not because of the honor, but because the world now knew what he and his men had done, and more importantly, why it mattered. They had shown that freedom isn't weakness, that ordinary people can do impossible things, that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being terrified and fighting anyway. On December 16th every year until he died in 2016, Book would sit quietly and remember. Remember the cold, the fear, the sound of 500 Germans marching up that road, the faces of his men as they fought with everything they had. And he would think about the lesson they had taught, not just to the Germans who attacked them, but to everyone. The lesson that tyranny always underestimates freedom, that evil always thinks good is weak, that dictators always believe democracies will fold under pressure. And they are always, always wrong. Because free people, when pushed to the wall, when everything is on the line, will fight with a strength that no amount of propaganda or military training can match. They fight not because they are forced to, but because they choose to. And that choice, that free choice, makes all the difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.